Hello again, and welcome back to the intermediate chess course. This week I'm going to dive straight in with a puzzle, and then I'm going to show you something that I think is very useful for you guys to know in the endgame, a little difference, which I think maybe some of you won't be aware of. We'll come to that in a second. First of all, it's the puzzle. So I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. All right. I'm going to play a move for white, first of all, and then you guys are going to try and work out the best response, okay? Maybe I can ask you what white might do here. Does white have a clever trick that they can play? You can pause the video if you like and try to spot it. Well, the trick, which appears to be clever, is this move. Now, you may know that this is called a fork, okay? And it looks pretty dangerous because, you know, we can't actually use our knight to defend our rook, and we can't use our rook to defend our knight, unfortunately. So it looks like we're in a bit of a pickle. How are we going to get out of this fine mess? Well, pause the video again and see if you can work out a way of effectively counter-attacking. How can we create a bigger threat than what white is doing? If you need to set this up on the board, by all means do that. But I'm going to show you a way of defending. It's called active defense. So notice that white is threatening to win material, either winning a rook or more likely winning a knight, okay? But we need to create a bigger threat. So how about this move? Rook to f8. So you may be able to spot exactly what the threat is now. If white was foolish and took this knight, then we have rook down to the back. And guess what? This is checkmate, because there's no way that the white king can escape. It's stuck behind its own pawns. Now, this is quite a typical checkmate. You might see this a lot. You may even have done it or become the victim of it. It's called a back rank checkmate or a back rank mate. And it's always very important to be aware of this. A way that you can often get out of this kind of problem, at least, you know, to stop it from happening, is to move up one of these pawns. So I would recommend this one, so that when the rook or queen or whatever comes down to attack, then you've got somewhere to run to. We call that Luft in chess, which I think we've covered already, but Luft is German, means air. So I think white in this situation should not take the knight. They should perhaps consider a move such as this one, okay? So that when black's rook comes down, at least we have a space to run to, okay? So this is called active defense. It's a good way of getting out of a tricky situation. On now to the next part of what I wanted to show you. This is an endgame situation. And just to let you know, we're playing as black, but white is coming towards us. So the pawn has just moved down and it's planning now to reach the end and become a queen. So when we have queen and king against queen and king, that's most likely going to be a draw because it's very difficult for one team to progress unless the other one makes a mistake. So if this pawn gets to the end safely, then that's most likely going to be a draw. What do you think the result of this game could be with best play by black? Well, black can win this game, okay? We're going to work out how to do it in this lesson, okay? So it's a very possible situation. You may find that you managed to get a queen by promoting your pawn, for example, but the opponent has, in the meantime, managed to get their pawn towards the end as well. But we just got there before them, but now there's a way that we need to try to win the game by eliminating their pawn, okay? So a move like this, queen to g8, that sort of thing won't work because all that white will do is push the pawn up and block the check, and then that's going to be a draw because, okay, white can then swap queens, and then it will be 2 kings on the board, a dead draw. Okay, so again, if you need to use a physical board to do this, you can follow it on there. So that won't work. So can you come up with a good move here for black that would work and would prevent white from promoting the pawn? I would recommend this move, queen to d5. Okay, notice we're putting white in check. So obviously then white cannot promote the pawn. They have to move the king. So I would say most likely white wants to give themselves a chance of still promoting. So if the king steps in front of the pawn, that's good for black because it means that white cannot promote the pawn. So I'd say most likely to happen is something like this, king to c8. Okay. Now notice that again, white has an opportunity to bring this pawn to the end if we're careless. If we allow that to happen. So can you find me another move for black which would stop this from happening? I think we can rely on a tactic. Okay, now remember we talked a little bit about forks, pins, skewers, discovered attacks. Now, I would say the fork is very useful in this situation because we can attack the pawn and the king at the same time. We could go here, that's one possibility, but then black will just probably go back and defend. So we're back to where we started. This, however, is a much better move because we're approaching closer to the king and closer to the pawn, okay? So if white wants to avoid losing this pawn, they've got to come closer, like this. And again, we're looking for a fork. Can you find me a fork that would attack both king and pawn at the same time? Yeah, there is one. Queen here, queen to d3. So now this is what's called an ultimatum for white. White has to move the king either to e8 or c8. So obviously going to c8 is no good because black will just take the pawn for free, and then king and queen against king is a win. So white must step in front of their pawn. Now, as we talked about earlier, this is not really what white wants to do because they're stopping the pawn from getting to the end, and which is ultimately the goal of this. So how can we make use of the move that we've been given? Thinking about time again. Remember last lesson we talked about time and space. We've been given a move here. How would you make best use of it? Well, the answer is actually to use another piece, not just the queen, but the king. How about if we bring this king closer? If we can get the king towards the pawn, we can attack it a second time, and then we'll be able to win the pawn, in theory. Let's see what happens. So, okay. Let's say we go here. Well, again, actually, we've gained a move here because notice that white cannot promote the pawn. Why? Well, because actually, this is an illegal move. White would be in check in this situation. So the best thing we can do is most likely to bring the king closer again. Okay, because we can't, there's no need to move the queen because it's actually doing a pin, it's doing a good job. So white realizes their error and they decide, right, okay, I'm going to go like this. Again, we want to look for moves here that do tricks. So looking for pins and forks, okay? Now, okay, we could check the king, that would be perfectly good. But the move I would recommend is a pin, okay? Notice we can't approach with the king yet, because then that pawn will reach the end and it will check the enemy king. So that will be a draw by king and queen and king and queen. So we can't approach yet. The best thing I think to do is to play something like this. again, pinning the pawn. The pawn cannot get to the end because it would be check. So the pawn cannot get to the end because it would be check. So, well, white's trying to get out of this, gets out of the pin. Notice we can't play a move like this because then white could promote the pawn. So what do? Well, we resort to checks again. Okay. So again, white doesn't really want to step in front of the pawn. Much better to step away. Okay. So can we look for a fork? Is there a fork that we can play here? Yeah, I mean, there's this one again, which is possible, but much better is to approach the pawn more closely, like this. So check, pawn cannot promote because it's check. King must go here. And then we can do a second fork. We attack the king and pawn. If the king goes to this side, we just take the pawn for free. So therefore, the king must go here. The king is now in front of the pawn. It cannot promote. So we have an extra move. We can use this move to attack this pawn a second time. Now, can you tell me how to do that? Well, the trick basically is to play this. We can use a second piece, the king, in this situation to attack the pawn. And because obviously the pawn is going this way, so it's not attacking the king. So in this situation, white has only got one move. They can't go this way because of the queen. They can't go here because of the king. There's only one move, which is this. Notice if the pawn wasn't there, if it was off the board, this would actually be stalemate. This is something we've got to be very careful of because notice that the white king can't move anywhere legally, so that would be a draw. But because the pawn is shielding the king, this queen is not attacking the square here. So king here is the only move. And now, can we take the pawn? Well, yes, we can. We can do queen takes pawn. We've won the pawn, and then it's mate next move. Can you find the checkmate for black on the next move? Yeah, I think this is somewhat of intermediate level. I think this is quite straightforward. Queen there is checkmate, and you'll see on the right-hand side the notation, queen to c7, and then the hashtag there means checkmate. Okay, so well done if you got all of that. It's quite tricky. You might need to repeat this video just to just to familiarize yourself. That's perfectly fine. I'm going to show you a second example of the same thing. Okay, you might think, well, why are we focusing so much on this? Well, I think there's some real beauty in the endgame. There's some things that you would not expect to happen. And often, the team that needs to defend, so for example, we have a queen against the pawn. So the team that's defending is white. White's not really trying to win. White's just trying to achieve something, i.e. trying to get the pawn to the end, and therefore most likely get a draw. So one team is fighting for the win, the other team's fighting for the draw. That's most likely what's going to happen. So this is really interesting, I think. Who do you think should win this game? You'd think probably black, right? Because you've just seen what would happen on a normal situation against queen against pawn. But there's an interesting point here. This pawn is a bishop's pawn. What that means is that it started on the same line as where the bishops start. So this is where the bishops start, here and here. And therefore, we call it a bishop's pawn. Okay? Now, that is significant. Let's say that black tried to do the usual stuff. Pins, that kind of thing. Well, the good news here is that actually, white can draw this game. And there's a really simple way of doing it, but I'm going to show you what white could do, first of all. They could try this method, as usual. They could simply go for the same idea as what happened before. So that means that, okay, black is restricted a little bit to to what they did before. So again, white doesn't really want to come in front of the pawn. They have to stay away, basically. So they go like this. Now here, black has an opportunity to attack both of white's pieces by a fork. Now there's a number of ways of doing that. You can go like this, you can go like that. And also, I would say perhaps an even better move might be to come here, because then obviously the pawn can't get to the end. But there's a really interesting point here. So white has to defend the pawn, and we do the usual check, which is to attack the king and the pawn at the same time. Now, normally, white would have to come in front of the pawn in order to stop it from being taken. But there's an alternative in this situation. Believe it or not, white can do this move. Because, ask yourself, what would happen if black took this pawn? What would be the result of the game if black took that pawn? Well, let's see. This is stalemate. It's a very clever trick, I think. Stalemate is always a possibility in the endgame. If you're losing, it's often good to go to the end anyway, just in case your opponent does a stalemate. You can sometimes trick them into doing a stalemate, which you wouldn't normally expect, maybe. And this is really clever. So that means that black can't take this pawn. So, well, we can't bring the king closer because, again, white can promote the pawn. So we have to prevent this pawn getting to the end. The best way probably is either like this or like this. I'll choose this one. But then we're back to the same situation as before. White just needs to protect the pawn. Again, we can't move the king closer because of the promotion. Okay, white's forced into the same situation again to check the king and the pawn. White doesn't need to do that. White can just go into the corner. And notice that, again, the stalemate trap is on, so black has to do the same sort of thing. I notice that now this position has occurred, I believe, 3 times. Certainly this position has too. So we can, the white here can claim a draw by repetition. It's called threefold repetition. If the same position occurs 3 times, not in a row, but if it occurs 3 times, so I'm going to click on move number, let's just move that out of the way. This is move number 8. Move number 6, exactly the same position. Again, move number 4, exactly the same position. So that means that white can say, hey, that's occurred 3 times, I'm going to claim a draw. Okay? So that is really interesting, I think, that depending on where the pawn is, the result of the game can either be a win for the team with the queen or a draw, depending on which file the pawn is on. If it's a bishop's pawn, it's a draw. If it's in the middle, for example, then it's going to be a win for black in this situation. I'm going to unshare my screen now. I hope that was interesting. I wanted to show you this idea because it demonstrates that the endgame can also be really interesting. I think often the endgame is kind of underrated. And I said last lesson that obviously if you're really good at the opening, then that gives you an advantage. But obviously if you can't finish off the game in the endgame, then that's all your effort will go to waste. So it's important that you know your checkmates in the endgame, but also it's important that you recognize, what kind of situations you can use to your advantage. So if you're the defending team in that king and pawn against king and queen position, then you have an opportunity perhaps of a stalemate when you wouldn't expect that. Okay? So I hope that was useful, and I guess I'll see you next time. Enjoy the video.